Australians, oh let us rejoice, for we are young and free, or something to that effect. Welcome to an Australian version of Dan Really Likes Wine, and a show inspired by Francois Pienaar, not because of games he may or may not have played against Australia, but because of bumping into him a couple of months ago, and he said to me, "Dan, you must meet my hairdresser." Now that's always a conversation that has some slightly interesting interpretations. I thought, well, maybe he just feels I need to restyle the hair for television. No, he said, my hairdresser is mad about wine and has got a great collection of Australian wine. Now, his hairdresser isn't Australian, he's a South African guy called Jeremy Nell, but he does have a vast wine collection, and I met him, we caught up, and he introduced me to, amongst other wines, the wines of Penfolds in Australia. And if you know much about the wine world, you'll know that Penfolds is one of the biggest names in international wine. Now, what made it particularly interesting for me was a speech made at the Nederburg Wine Auction last year, where there was a suggestion by the keynote speaker that South Africa needs its own Penfolds, a big, strong, high-end wine estate, wine brand that can lead the rest of the country's wine brands into a new space internationally. Because so often we struggle with South African wines, people just don't give them enough credit, don't realise they're as good and as valuable as they actually are. And so part of what the Distel Group, who put together the Nederburg Wine Auction, are looking at doing, Richard Rushton, the MD, spoken about it, is finding a brand that could be the next Penfolds. And maybe it's somebody like Durbanville Hills, who can become both big enough and quality enough to fly that South African flag and bring the rest of the industry along with us. So to understand all of that a little better, to see why Penfolds is so highly regarded and why some Penfolds wine costs an absolute fortune, Jeremy Nell very kindly sent me up a collection of the Penfolds wine that all forms part of the Treasury Club. Treasury Wines look after Penfolds internationally, and this is a selection of the Penfolds wine that he sent up. And the first of those to try out is something called the Bin 28. Now, the Penfolds wines tasted here all form part of something called the 90 Plus Club. They're wines that have been rated by a variety of high-end tasters, magazines, publications as over 90 points. And this is the first of these, the Penfolds Bin 28. The name Barossa Valley might mean something to you. Barossa Valley to Australia, as sort of Stellenbosch, I suppose, would be to South Africa. It's a very central part of the wine-growing world in Australia. And this particular wine, originally the Bin 28, stems from that Barossa Valley. It's now wine that comes from across Australia. And the bin part was always something that fascinated me about Penfolds. What did it mean? Well, quite simply, it refers to the area in which the wine is stored. And this Bin 28 was one of the first storage areas and wine from the Barossa Valley. Penfolds has been going for 140, 150 years now. It's quite a while, if not more than that. The Penfolds, Dr. Charles and his wife Mary, who came over to Australia, started things off. I'm not sure they would have thought that it would have got quite so big and been quite so successful as it has become. It is an Australian flagship, and this, their Bin 28, a little more entry level than some of the other wines we will have, but at a 90 plus point score across a number of publications, it's clearly a wine that's got a fair amount of attention. And that's a very good start. That's a South Australian Shiraz. I lived in Australia for a year. When I was 16, I was a Rotary Youth Exchange student. Didn't really drink any wine when I was 16, but wine was certainly spoken of. And the Australians were very proud of the wine that they made, just as we are by wine in South Africa. And it's only in recent visits to Australia that I've been able to taste and start to appreciate the wide array of wine that they do have. The South Australian Barossa Valley is spoken of in very hushed tones. Terrific wine tends to come from that Barossa Valley, and this Bin 28, the Kalimna Shiraz, is an example thereof. It's very rich, it's got that lovely chocolatey tobacco type feel to it, incredibly smooth. If this is just the entry level point of what we're drinking today, then Penfolds is off to a very good start. Next up from Team Penfolds, the Bin 407, or a little easier to remember, the 2014 Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the one thing with Penfolds that confuses me a little, all these numbers, but you get used to them after a while, and then you start to pick up things that stick in the mind. That Bin 28 will certainly stick for the quality thereof, and the Bin 407 could well do the same. It's still a relatively young Cabernet Sauvignon, but the winemaker suggests that it's already drinking very nicely indeed. It's in that 90 points plus club, which suggests again that given the heritage of Penfolds, the quality of the wine they generally make, and the suggestion of the winemaker plus the critics, that although that was good, this could be even better. A part of my time in Australia when I was 16 was travelling through the country. I spent a month seeing a vast part of the country, and part of that time was spent in South Australia. It included Adelaide and some little towns in South Australia, and even for a 16-year-old from rural Zimbabwe as I was then, it probably wasn't the most electric of places I'd ever been to. Adelaide is the city of churches, which doesn't always suggest excitement. But had I known about the wine, had I been a wine drinker then, which at 16 of course I wasn't, my idea of the place might have been a little different. And Penfolds would have been at the forefront of that, because not only is that Shiraz from South Australia, but so too this Bin 407 Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's also got a real allure to it. It feels a little younger than the preceding wine. It's only a year older, but being Cabernet Sauvignon maybe needs slightly longer just to settle a touch. It's still a beautiful wine, but can probably just settle down again in another year or two and get even better. Already though, a fine example of Cabernet Sauvignon. And a good reason to add the number 407 to my list of preferred Australian wine. From Bin 407 to Bin 389, and in this case a Cabernet Shiraz blend. And this one's known as the Baby Grange. What does that mean? Well, the Grange is up at the top end of the Penfolds offering. You're looking at about 600 Australian dollars a bottle. That's millions of rand. It's beyond my calculation. This isn't the Grange, but it's looked at as being the baby version thereof. I think they make it in the same barrels the year after. It's got a similar feel to it. So maybe not quite as high end as the Grange, but heading in a very similar direction, and not quite the same price point. This, I think you're looking at around about kind of the 1,000 rand mark. So it's not inexpensive wine, and as a result you'd expect something to be pretty good. The evidence on bottles 1 and 2 suggests it should be. So this particular bin, Bin 389, getting my numbers right, first came about the 1960s. There was a bloke by the name of Schubert, which sounds like it could be South African, who became their first proper winemaker, cellar master. He's celebrated for all the work he did with Penfolds, and he set the benchmark for a lot of the wine that's made today by the Penfolds team as a whole, and this was one he had a particular hand in. And you can see why Mr. Schubert was so revered. That's another exceptional wine. It's soft, it's full of velvet, it's got some lovely darker notes to it, and it really is as good as anything the Australians have produced since Kylie Minogue and Jason Donovan. That's lovely. And so to our final Penfolds, our final Australian, and it comes in this slightly intimidating box. It shows you exactly where our South Australians are, and this is the 2013 vintage of the St. Henri Shiraz. We're at French, I'd go Henri, but as we are in the surrounds of Adelaide, Henri mate, and the only challenge is how to open it. Now this is an indication of quite how seriously this wine is taken. Not only is it in a box that's taken me almost half an hour to work out how to open, but there is also a tag. You can let you know who has given it to you, in this case Jeremy the hairdresser. Some notes you might want to throw in there, i.e. looks awesome, try not to drink too soon. and the date in which you've got it and put it into your cellar. So you'd put all that together if you were hanging on to it. But given that we're doing a tasting and filming, we are not. Now, it could hang on, certainly if you believe the winemaker, because we're now sitting in 2017. According to the tasting notes, this should come into its own in about 2046. Now, I'm not sure that 30 years or thereabouts is a time that I can hang on to a bottle of wine for. Gee, I'd be almost 50 by then. And so I'll drink it now, but it does suggest there's a huge belief in the guys who've made this wine that it's got an awfully long time to wait if you want to see the very best of it. So I have to confess I'm quite excited about drinking this. It got delivered a couple of weeks ago and it's been sitting untouched in my cellar, but I have been casting covetous looks at it from then until now. And now I finally get to open it. 2013, so it's a lot younger than the winemaker suggests it could be when you want to drink it. But given that by 2046 there'll be plenty more wine to drink, I might as well give it a go now. It's the St. Henri vintage, St. Henri vintage, and it is a wine that sits in very much the upper end of what you can drink when it comes to the work of Penfolds. And it's this kind of wine that's given the Australian brand such great status around the world. I would be fascinated to try this in 2046. In fact, I'm going to put it in my diary to do so and grab another bottle to hide away somewhere, because already this is quite lovely. It is an exceptional wine. We do drink some terrific wine on Dan Really Likes Wine, and I'm very lucky in that regard. And this is right up there with some of the best that we've had. It's polished, it's smooth, it's rich, it's just full of everything you'd want in a really, really good bottle of red wine. It's only 4 years old, tastes like it could be significantly more than that, but it also tastes like it could do justice to what the winemaker suggests and last for another couple of decades, if not more so. There's a lot that Australians have to answer for, a lot that we can hold them account for. If you watch the Dan Nichols show, my other show, you'll know I had Shane Warne on recently. He's got a lot to answer for terrorising South Africans. Australian rugby referees have a lot to answer for. Kylie Minogue, the Locomotion, has a lot to answer for. But I almost think that the collection of this wine, and in particular the St. Henri mate, Shiraz, vintage 2013, could almost make up for those cricketing, rugby and musical indiscretions. It's wine that's available in South Africa. It's not better than our best South African wine, but it's certainly up there with some of our best wine, and it's available at Norman Goodfellows in South Africa. A guy called Solly Kramer runs that. Drop in, ask for him. Penfolds is about 170 years old. Solly's about the same age. Tell him I sent you. Tell him you'd like to try some. Take some South African as well. Put them together, and I think you'll have a fantastic combination of New World wine at its very, very best. And in Penfolds, an example of perhaps where one of our South African estates can get to in due course and fly our South African flag very high right around the world. Cheers.